question about whether cognition penetrates perception also has significance for what we were talking about in week 1, Russell's principle of acquaintance. Let me remind you that. We asked the question, what sort of relation between a subject and an object has to obtain if the subject is able to think about the object? And as a candidate answer to that question, we considered the idea that the relation is one of acquaintance, fundamentally. Now that word fundamentally is hiding quite a bit of work that we did last week. Now you remember that one paradigmatic form of acquaintance is perception. The acquaintance view therefore depends on the idea that perception is more primitive than and can explain the possibility of thought. But that idea is challenged by the existence of cases where cognition penetrates perception, assuming, of course, that there really are any such cases. So let me explain to you now just how that challenge arises. So if you're Russell, you think that acquaintance, and of course the paradigm case of acquaintance is perception, is something more primitive than thought, and which explains the possibility of thought. Now that makes perfect sense if we have a view on which there are these stimuli in the world which activate receptors, and those things result in perceptual processes, and then those in turn result in arousal, as when I'm shocked by one of my children jumping out of the cupboard at me. Thoughts, I'm going to get that child back somehow, I'm going to trick them for sure. Reactions, a jump in the air and yelp, and so on. Now, as long as we think that the perceptual processes are separate from the thought processes, the acquaintance view, as I'm calling it, makes a lot of sense. But what do we mean by separate here? That's kind of a metaphor. The way to cash out that metaphor is in terms of encapsulation. The perceptual processes are encapsulated from thoughts. That's to say that the direction of flow of information is one way. The perceptual processes modify the thoughts, but you don't get the thoughts modifying the perceptual processes. There's no arrow going back the other way here. On the other hand, if we accept that there is cognitive penetration, of perception, see my spelling's completely gone off here. If we accept that there is cognitive penetration of perception, then we do have to fill in this reverse arrow here. And in that case, it doesn't really seem like there's that much of a difference between the perception and the thought. It's really just all one process. There's the stimuli, there are the receptors, and it's really just perception and thought is going to be all one thing. It's going to be all one thing here, and that's going to jointly lead to action. Now there's no absolute guarantee that if you're a proponent of the cognitive penetration of perception, you would necessarily have to abandon the idea that there is a distinction between perception and thought, such that you could say perception is more primitive than thought and explains the possibility of it, as those who are with Russell on the acquaintance view would like to say. It's just very hard to understand why you would want to say that anymore. What could motivate the idea that perception is somehow separate from thought if you think that there is a two-way exchange of information not just from perception to thought, but also from thought to perception. What would it even mean now to say that perception is something distinct from thought and more primitive than it? Very hard to understand. So now we have a second reason for thinking that the question about cognitive penetration is significant. Does cognition penetrate perception? We don't know. But if it doesn't, we're assured that perception is distinct from thought, and so there is no obstacle to the acquaintance view. On the other hand, if cognition does penetrate perception, we don't know whether it does or not yet, but we're going to see some evidence that it does eventually. And if that evidence really supports the view that cognition penetrates perception, then we would need a further, as yet unprovided theoretical reason to hold that perception is distinct from and more fundamental than thought. So we would have a straightforward, if non-deductive, challenge to the acquaintance view. So now we've seen two reasons for thinking that the question about cognitive penetration is significant. It matters for what we did last week concerning acquaintance as the basis for thought, and it matters for what's coming later in the course concerning relations between theory and observation. All that's left is to evaluate the evidence. Which side does the evidence currently available best support?